camera's like, shh, no, I'm just looking. And I'm like, oh, okay, he gets what I'm doing. He's just taking his time to look at it very carefully. So that was incredibly important for me to have that, oh, here's someone who's taking me seriously and gets what I'm doing and is looking very carefully. And he was also instrumental in really offering good advice as opposed to, looks good, keep doing what you're doing. He was just saying, here's a stack of things that you should look at. This is important. Look at Harvey Kurtzman, look at Johnny Craig, look at how someone's breaking down this story and see why it works. And we would have those kinds of conversations. And then actually really having those kinds of constraints about creating a story and laying out a story was very important for me early on. Like, you need to limit, you have to figure out. I think I was just a much more intuitive artist originally, and then this was a way of thinking about why something works, why the rhythm of a page works, why those things work. So
well,
that's
pretty much, that's really literally what I was going to ask you, because I can't imagine meeting Art Spiegelman at a certain age where he would naturally be a mentor. You can't talk to Art without getting a lesson of some kind.
Right.
And and you were so young.
Right.
Exactly what you're talking about. Like so much of it is just intuitive. It's like that's that next step to understand what you're trying or are doing.
You're kind of imitating on the surface, what you're attracted to, but then you don't know what the kind of skeletal structure is or why something's successful.
Yeah.
So Art Spiegelman pointed me towards Harvey Kurtzman, the early Harvey Kurtzman stories, and just technically looking like, here's what he's doing, here's why this works, and that was.
Were you able to track down the material he was talking about in those days? Is that what you did?
Yeah, I think there were enough things that were available, and again, I had looked at some of those really early examples in paperbacks. I had grown up looking at those things as well, but I never analyzed them. I never figured out why they functioned the way they did.
Well, that's a good question. Let me think about this for a second. I was going to go into, we're going to ask you about drugs or sex, but I think I'll start with the sex element, which is that your comics always have like a kind of a creepy sexual vibe. But and literally, this is the interesting thing of what you're doing. In the new book, I wouldn't say there's a creepy sexual vibe in the new book. What I mean is that there aren't too many comic artists who can manage to infuse these very understated scenes with what I think of as some kind of sexual language going on that's not really in the narrative. So even like in this comic, and I felt this in Black Hole a lot too, which is when the characters are spending time together, you can almost feel the chemistry between the bodies of the people in the strip. And I sense you're going for that, but are you really like trying to calculate this into the work? Or are you just hoping it's a byproduct of the narrative?
I think there's certainly hope, but there's also trying to figure out how to make that work. Yeah, I'm trying to.
And it's uncomfortable often.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about specific examples, but there's times where it's like, how do you capture this moment? How do you capture something that's this kind of extreme moment of this, something that involves passion, or I don't know what the right word would be, but it can be understated. I think what happens in most fiction, or especially in comics, is that anything that's kind of sexual enters into it. Or I should step back and say the kind of comics that I grew up with. Anything that was sexual was either kind of over-the-top sex comic or kind of this titillation. So the whole, the reason it existed was to be this kind of titillating, oh, this is sexy, but nothing was really, the subject matter of, two human beings relating to each other, that was never really looked at very carefully, I don't think. There was certainly, again, going back to romance comics, there's a little bit of that there, and there's a few comics that are kind of interesting in that regard, but they're very few and far between. So
yeah, they really were. Even the cartoonists who were chomping at the bit in those days to get away from like the restraints of the mainstream comics. When they would go do their own comics, like Wally Wood,
Yeah.
it would end up just being really juvenile,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah.
Yeah, which is a shame because I always thought Wally Wood, the one quality he had in his work, whatever I thought of the actual stories or whatever, is that the comics were genuinely charged with sexual energy. They were very juvenile.
With repressed sexual
Yeah,
energy.
but it's like there's very few comics I ever think of that have like an actual sexual quality to the work itself. Crumb has it too.
Mhm.
Like where it's like it can't be divorced from the comics themselves. There's a lot of comics about sex or try to do, like you say, a sex comic,
Right.
which are usually actually the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely,
They
yeah.
turn off.
Yeah.
I think that this is why I kind of bring it up, is you're not going for either of those directions. You're kind of trying, like you said, you're moving down this middle path where you're dealing with something that doesn't get into comics much. And yeah, I guess I'll leave that into drugs. It's like, because you have an awful lot of psychedelic experience in your life. Are you drawing on drug experience without getting too personal? Or are you is this a kind of like, is it mystic experience you're aiming for? Like,
It's drawing on very specific drug experiences from when I was younger. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's definitely that. There was a when I was much younger, there was kind of some spiritual quality to taking drugs, and then that kind of went away. But yeah, it's definitely dream experience and whatever.
Do you like surrealism? Or do you like surrealistic art?
It depends on
Yeah.
who it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I can look at Magritte and enjoy a Magritte. I remember one of the first paintings that I remember like really liking. My parents, we lived outside of Washington D.C. and went to whatever the National Gallery is there, and there was a Magritte painting that is just a plate with a piece of ham with an eye in the center of that, and I really liked that. And I internalized that image in my mind. I didn't know. So he was doing this big round circular thing that was ham, but I thought of it as a pancake. So I thought, oh, a pancake with an eye. And that really, I thought that was good art, so that's surreal.
That really ties in kind of in what you were talking about earlier, which is, looking for things outside of the bland culture. I can remember those kind of experiences too with certain kind of imagery. But certainly, like say what's the name of the book where you gathered the three, Sugar Skull and Expo and
Well, they got collected as Last Look.
Okay, Last Look. You're really working heavily there with a surreal landscape, which seems to me like you've invested a lot of your narrative energy into what I would call dream life.
Sure. Yeah. I just find it interesting. I get drawn into it and take that kind of imagery seriously, and think it sounds dumb to talk about analyzing dreams, but I think in some of the stories I'll take repeating elements and forge them into the narrative that just makes it rich.
Yeah,
and
it is a
interesting
rich
to me.
body of source for creativity for sure.
Yeah.
It's so weird that we dream. I
It
think
is
about it
weird.
every day. You have two lives. You have your daily life, and then you have this night life, which is you wake up and you just say like, oh well, those are just dreams. But it's incredibly potent stuff that happens every night.
That's true.
And it's very odd. But this isn't about me. I want to talk to you about Europe. You have a long relationship with Europe, and you're very popular over there. And it seems to me that I would suspect, is it true that you have a bigger fan base in Europe than in North America?
I have absolutely no idea. I don't.
And you lived in Spain for a while, didn't you?
I lived in Italy for maybe 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you ever think of going there, of living in Europe?
Not anymore. It was something, Yeah, not anymore.
Too late in the game kind of thing?
I mean, the thing that always makes me crazy is that I struggle speaking English, but it's just this is like such a shameful thing to go to a country and expect them to speak to you in English, which they do, because everybody knows English and German and Spanish and Italian, and it's just like, oh, here's this guy again, that, you know, it's like, talk to me in English. So that just makes me cringe, that part. I mean, everyone's always is very nice to me, but it just, I feel like the ugly American that shows up and expects everybody to, you know, speaking my tongue.
Yeah, no,
So that part's a stumbling block. Even though I did try to, I went to Italian classes, I had Italian friends, and I tried to, just did not take hold.
We haven't mentioned the other primary source for you, which is Tintin.
Sure.
Which is, of course, Franco-Belgian comics. Right. How did you even come in contact with those?
Well, I don't know whether they came to Canada as much as, maybe more so than
Quebec.
the US,
Yeah.
because of the French-speaking population. But in the late 50s and the early 60s, Golden Press put out 6 American versions of Tintin, and my dad went to the bookstore all the time and was looking out for me. He brought home that first book, and my head exploded. At that point, it was just like the best thing that I'd ever seen. It was, you know, I couldn't read yet, but I would sit and just be totally immersed in those books. As an adult, I can see plenty of the, you know, the problematic problems with the story and, you know, the cultural, that I understand now, but as a kid, you know, I bought into it. And so it was, out of all the cartoonists that are my age, I've never met anyone who, you know, younger artists, because they started being translated and brought over to the United States, probably in the late 70s or, you know, 80s, and now you can find them anywhere. But at that point, I mean, I've never met another cartoonist, American cartoonist that grew up with those specific books. But
I know, I mean, I didn't discover them until I was in my 20s.
Right.
So they couldn't have that kind of primary influence on me. But I can see when I look at your work, obviously, I mean, one of the things that's going on there is that fully realized world that Hergé was drawing in.
right.
And the way that the characters, though, are cartoons. I mean, your work sometimes depends, like in the new book, it's not that dramatic, the difference between the foreground and the background. But in, like, you know, in Sugar Skull or whatever, it's like clearly there's something going on there that still has some Hergé in it.
Sure. Well, that one was very directly taking that idea, you know, trying to internalize that, whatever that world that I was attracted to, and putting that into a comic.
Yeah, that seems where I feel like there's that fetish thing of something that's deep in you that you're going to explore it.
Yeah.
And like find some core of whatever it is that, you know, won't let go of it.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
I felt the same kind of thing when I saw Hergé. Like, I was shocked by the weird dichotomy of real versus cartoon. Like the backgrounds being such real
Well,
things.
those were more the later, like the very early stuff is much more integrated. So it was primarily was primarily all his drawing. But later on, he had a staff that would do these very intricate backgrounds, and, you know, making sure every bolt on the car and the steering wheel and everything was perfect. He had people researching all those things. But early on, it was, you know, it was well, you know, well put together. But you know, it didn't have that same kind of, you're talking about a fetish quality, but making everything is absolutely perfectly in space, and you recognize what building that is, and if it's going to be an airplane, it's going to be, you know, a very specific airplane.
I'm going to totally change gears here and ask you. You're getting older. I'm getting older. I'm very aware of like how many years I might have left.
Right.
Are you thinking in terms now as an artist, like how many books you're going to make? Are you planning out, like, I've got 5 books or 3 books?
I know you are.
I am.
And to be honest, I'm really not. I've kind of reached this point in my life where it's not like I don't care, but I'm not going to obsess over that. I feel weirdly more relaxed, and that might have something to do with, I don't know, that doesn't feel like something hanging over my head. And and there's also, I think that may be too, that I don't know if I've got much more to say, and I'm not saying that in a terrible way, I don't know. I mean, if
Are
there's.
you always working one book to the next? Like, okay, here's a book and now I'm done.
Yeah, I don't, yeah, pretty much. I get very immersed in whatever story it is, and I'm not, so even when we're talking about my older books, I'm like, what, I can't remember the name of that character, what are you talking about? Because I get, it's like putting blinders on, I'm very focused on that, the immediacy of the book I'm working on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't multitask very well.
Are you making the book like the classic thing, like you're trying to make the book that you want? Like that, if this is the ideal book I want in the world, here it is.
I think that was more an impulse earlier on, I think. And I think that I've kind of, not past that, but I'm not worried about that. I'm just like, I want something that looks beautiful, but I think way back when, especially when I was, I remember like, we were talking about European books, like I want that, European album book with a little cloth spine. I want that, and so now I can get it. So now it's kind of like, oh, it's another book with a cloth spine. Okay, everyone's used to it now. But for me, it had this exotic quality of just like, it's just this beautiful object, and I've always been attracted to, beautifully produced books.
Do you ever pull the old books off and read them or look at them?
Not very often.
When I was young, I always thought that's what you would do when you were an author. You'd pull your books off the shelf and proudly be like, oh yes. But it's not, you can't stand to even look at them.
I don't have a problem with that. It's just, there's some earlier work that I look at and that looks like the work of another human being. I couldn't write that story. I have this character called El Borba, and somebody, are you ever going to do another El Borba story? And I'm thinking, I don't even know how I made those ones. I could draw him. I'd be able to do that. But whatever my brain was at that time, I thought, oh, I'm going to put him in this situation as he's a detective and he does this and that. I have no idea what I
Well,
would
that's
do.
something I was going to ask you about. Those early comics are well, they're funny, or there's funniness to them.
Yeah, no, I think there's more humor in my early work.
But your work isn't funny anymore.
There's occasion, well, if you read the
Unless
very
I'm
last
wrong
thing.
and that's what you were intending.
No, no, you're absolutely right. There's occasionally, there's something I just did that I handed you, that weird romance card. It's a very dark story, but it's also got some very, humorous moments.
Okay.
I could be wrong.
No, I'm sure you're right. I haven't read it yet.
But
But I would say like the last few books.
I think, you're right. So I think especially Last Look, that collection of the trilogy, that I was going through like pretty severe depression. And the fact that I even made it through that book, like I wasn't sure I was going to make it through. And it actually really showed.
You did all that precise artwork.
Yeah, well, I managed, but yeah, and that's a pretty dark book. It's kind of relentlessly tough, and that's not something I want to revisit too often. I'm happy to say that I'm not immersed in that anymore.
How are we doing for time, Peter?
Okay, we could take some questions from the audience.
Okay, well then, let's do that. Okay, so.
If anyone's going to have any questions, I'm bad at hearing, so either going to be really loud or if there's a microphone.
I'm here to repeat if any, repeat for the whole room if someone has yours.
Oh, perfect.
You commented about your tongue and sort of being angsty about language. So like Johnny 23, you play with words and language, and certainly with your new book, it coming out in French first. I had a completely different experience reading it in French with my Canadian public school French lessons than I did reading it in English, and made assumptions about the narrative that maybe weren't true, but actually gave me a more full experience. So I'm wondering, did you write it in English first and then translate it into French for the original release, or how did you construct that?
Yeah, everything is done. So the book that you have in front of you that's what I did myself, and I had nothing to do with the translation, and I don't know French, so I wasn't able to, quality control. I put my trust. I have a very good publisher, and I trust him to put, he's wants to make sure that things are right, but, yeah, I'm not quite sure. I think it's interesting that you read two versions that had a very different reaction to it, and that's interesting, but I don't know, I know that there's some cultural things that don't translate. I don't know what precisely that would be, because I've had some conversations with my publishers that, well, we would never use this kind of word to describe this, and, okay, I'm gonna trust you to figure that out, so.
At one point, I think Fincher was attached to a dead black hole, and I just wanted to know what happened to that project, and what do you think of adaptations of your work in the film?
Well, there's been no adaptations yet. There's been options on a number of things that are still out there. So the options for Black Hole, that's been, I don't know, it's been 15 years or whatever it is. I think there's been at least 5 different directors attached to it during that time. And there's been full-length scripts. I was telling Seth that, Neil Gaiman wrote a complete script for David Fincher, or whoever, I can't remember who it was for, but that's out there somewhere. And then there's for me, I really focus on the work that's my own work. And people are like, wouldn't you want to be involved in quality control? You can't. It doesn't work that way. The little bit that I've worked in movies, I know that it's this huge collaborative project, and once you're working with collaborations, there's just so many aspects that are out of your control. Even if you're working in an ideal situation with a director that you trust and you're on the same wavelength, there's just so many elements that are out of control. And I love the fact that with comics, I'm sitting at a table and everything that is coming out and that ends up in a printed book is mine. And if it's fucked up, then it's fucked up. But it's not, I can't blame anybody. Whereas I've seen, the few things that I've been involved with have, just been, I don't look back at them in a horrible way, but they're frustrating. They taught me that I need to be doing what I'm doing.
Could you say something about juxtaposing the beautiful and romantic with the grotesque? There's a lot of kind of ugly things in beautiful landscapes or romantic images of, couples in love, and suddenly there's a growth, or there's something in the background. Can you talk about those two things?
I don't know if I can talk about those things. I'm not sure. I'm thinking about what attracts you, okay? So a central core of Black Hole is the idea that our main protagonist has this romantic, very kind of naive, young romantic attraction to Chris. And inadvertently he's going over to his friend, he's going over to buy pot at some house, and there's a half-dressed girl with a tail in the kitchen. And he's not ready to realize that he has this visceral sexual response to that. So there's this kind of polarity of, here's this thing that you can't control what you're attracted to, or that idea. You may have this intellectual idea, this romantic idea on one side, and then have this physical reaction on the other side of that. So those are kind of ideas that I've always been interested in, and that can be with, what attracts you? Is this beauty, or is it I'm always interested in that.
Hi, Charles. Comic book artists that you were interested in, that people might not think that you were interested in, whether you were growing up or throughout your career. Comic book artists that you like, that people wouldn't necessarily associate, that you might like them.
I mean, someone would say, you would not think of me as being kind of the clear line Franco-Belgian, Hergé, that style. I mean, it showed up in the one book that I put out, but that would not be that assumption. I'm trying to think of
Jack Chick.
Oh yeah, I picked up a Jack Chick book today, so He's really repelling, he's really grotesque in the suggestion. I'm trying to think of who that might be. It's a good question, I just, off the top of my head, I don't have a good answer.
Thank you.
Were you aware of the ground level comics that were breaking away from the undergrounds in like the mid-70s, like the Mike Friedrich stuff in California with Trina in Spain and?
I was aware, I was always kind of aware of what was out there. There's things I wasn't reading. I kind of grew up with the Marvel comics and the superhero stuff, and then really, I was right at that cusp of like, I can't read this stuff anymore. I've lost interest in that. And then discovered Underground and really immersed myself in that. And for me, that was the direction I went into. But I was always kind of checking things out, but I was not, I never got re-immersed into mainstream comics. I wouldn't say, I can't think of anything that kind of blew me away at some point.
I have a question for both of you actually, and it's a very nerdy printing-based question. In the last couple of years, I've started to see a huge influx in interviews of very altruistic creators talking about the paper stock that they've used. Now, is that something, Charles and Seth, with throughout your careers that you paid attention to? I really want the trade paperback to be printed in this stock, and just in terms of the presentation and the feel and whatnot.
Without a doubt. I mean, the word fetish I mentioned earlier. I mean, one of the whole points of loving books is that you love the book, and so there are books you love, and you're like, oh, what is this paper stock? It's beautiful. It's big. It's got a tooth to it or whatever. And
There's something that's very important, Seth. When you crack open a book, you want to give it a good huff. Because if it's a huffable book, there's some books that go I think I'm going to get intoxicated. There's so much ink in there. But some of my books from Cornelius are like, God, this the entire room now smells like soy-based ink or something.
Soy ink. But the funny thing is that even though in some ways the modern digital technology has led to phenomenal freedom for artists to have books made in beautiful and more interesting ways, it has kind of the printing, sort of the fact that most of the printing has been sort of centralized in Hong Kong now has really diminished the numbers of paper stocks that are available. This is very nerdy.
You did ask a very nerdy question. You're going to get a nerdy answer.
So it's not as easy to do certain things as you might have done even 20 years ago, where you'd say I want a cloth binding, and people were like, well, it's a big hassle to have cloth binding now. You should have these artificial cloths.
Sure, if you wanted to, for example, I love the look of really cheap old newsprint, and it just doesn't exist anymore.
No, newsprint is now expensive. If you wanted a book printed on newsprint, which was of course the cheapest option in the past, nowadays the publisher would say, that we can't afford that.
Yeah.
You'll have to have that very expensive paper they couldn't have back in those days.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm just grateful that there are, I'm grateful that I have production values now that I never could have dreamed of. Yeah. When I started out, I asked, Ron Corday asked Chris Alvarez, could I have a color in this comic book? And he was like, absolutely not. And I said, well, how about a gray tone? And he was like, all right, a gray tone. And then a few years later, he said, I think we can afford a color. And he said, what color do you want? And I said, blue. And then now, 20, 30 years later, people are like, why isn't that Seth blue you use? What is that all about? Because they think it was some,
I think it is, there is a Seth blue.
Yeah.
I know that.
But it's funny now, there's no young cartoonist who thinks that way because they have this incredible production studio on their desk where they can literally do anything they want. So the options are very different.
And they've improved so much just as far as the quality of color printing is unbelievable. And so be happy. I look back at what I thought were well-printed books back in the day, and it's like, oh my God, it's pretty rough. So yeah, it's amazing the technology. That aspect of the technology is great.
Yeah, I mean, the world's been destroyed by the computer, but at least the books look great.
One more.
I kind of, that I think something that comes through so much is the link to romance through hair and how you endure hair, and the way that hair recurs in your work in different places. I don't know, can you talk a bit about your relationship to hair?
That's a very, very personal question. Again, it came out of emulating the work that I can't, it's like, why are you attracted to someone or something? You can't always come up with a complete answer, but you know that you're attracted to it. So I was attracted to a certain this kind of luscious looking, thick hair that was, drawn in the 40s and 50s and into the, in 40s and 50s. So again, just seeing reproductions of that stuff and thinking like, how is that done? I don't, shiny looking hair. I don't know. And then it did turn into kind of a, fetish object, or I don't know what you want to call it.
It's really mastered it, that's the thing too, it's like.
But there's sometimes, so for example, doing that, like, why did I make her hair slightly curly? And it's like, oh my God, I'm gonna draw that every panel and every page. It was rough. I could have made my life a little easier for myself.
Your interest in detail has really gone up over the years too. I think maybe in Black Hole, I really started to notice the big change when you started to do the end papers, which were like the ground.
Okay.
This fascination with like,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, kind of textural reality. Like I've seen it, that's a lot of work.
Well, it's, and again, this is something I can't explain, but there's certain marks and there's certain marks that just have almost like a physical reaction to it. They have a character to them, just as much as, one of the characters in the story that really has this strong, again, I'm not able to explain what that is, but just just like you're looking at something and you have a reaction to it that's, this visceral reaction to it.
Sure.
I do anyway.
One last question.
I just wanted to ask, from the early work to the stuff you're doing now, do you find that your creative process, both in the writing and the artwork, has changed, or and if so, how, and or is it sort of consistent with how we're always doing it?
It's changed in that I think early on it was much more direct. A piece of paper, let's draw all the panels, let's get everything done very, very directly. And now it's a little bit more fragmented. It's if I'm describing it, it's kind of boring, but it's so it's changed over the years. Just generally saying, I was much more direct. Everything was like pencil on paper, ink on paper, done. And then now it's drawing and doing a lot of technical things in between. So, and of course, like things that get finished on the computer as far as, I mean, I'm doing everything in ink and everything, the old-fashioned way, but then there's things that I'm manipulating and coloring on the computer so that's changed as well.
Thank you all for coming and having a really great bunch of questions to round it out. Charles and Seth are going to sign books outside after this event. Charles also took the time to sign a whole bunch of them ahead of time in case someone has to run for subway or can't wait in line. There are some pre-signed books out there as well. Thank you very much.